For more than 30 years, the identity of the BTK killer remained one of America's most disturbing mysteries. The man behind the letters, bind, torture, kill, lived a double life that no one in his small Kansas community could have imagined. Dennis Rader was a husband, a father, a church president, and a city compliance officer. But beneath that ordinary surface hid a calculating murderer who enjoyed playing games with the police and the media. By the early 2000s, the BTK case had gone cold. The last known crime was in 1991, and for over a decade, investigators had no fresh leads. However, in 2004, the killer suddenly re-emerged. Rader couldn't resist the attention. He began sending letters, packages, and even computer disks to local TV stations and newspapers, boasting about his past crimes and taunting the police to find him. In one of those communications, Rader made a critical mistake. He asked detectives if a floppy disk could be traced back to a computer, and the police, eager to catch him, replied through the newspaper, assuring him that it couldn't. Trusting them, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a Wichita TV station. Digital forensics experts at the FBI quickly uncovered metadata linking the file to a computer registered at Christ Lutheran Church. The name associated with the device was Dennis Rader. Investigators were cautious but hopeful. They quietly collected a DNA sample from Rader's daughter's medical record and compared it to evidence from the BTK crime scenes. The match was undeniable. The long hunt was over. On February 25, 2005, law enforcement surrounded Rader's vehicle near his home in Park City, Kansas. When officers confronted him, he calmly asked, "Why now?" Detective Ken Landwehr responded, "Because it's over." Rader showed no resistance. His calm, almost relieved demeanor shocked everyone present. After 3 decades of fear, the BTK killer was finally in custody. In interviews following his arrest, Rader appeared detached, analytical, and disturbingly proud of his actions. He confessed without hesitation, describing his crimes in chillingly detailed, matter-of-fact language. His ability to separate his family life from his violent crimes fascinated psychologists and horrified the public. He spoke as though BTK were an entirely different person inside him, a persona he referred to as a monster that demanded control. The small Kansas town of Park City struggled to process the truth. Neighbors who once saw Rader as a friendly community figure were devastated. Church members could not believe that their trusted president was the same man responsible for the city's darkest crimes. After his arrest in February 2005, Dennis Rader's double life unraveled piece by piece. Investigators were stunned by how ordinary his existence seemed. He lived in a modest home, had a long marriage, and worked as a city compliance officer, a job that allowed him to exercise small doses of power over others. That sense of control mirrored the very psychology that fueled his crimes. Rader confessed almost immediately, eager to explain himself. He described his murders in cold, methodical detail, explaining how each act was planned like a project. What horrified detectives most was not only the content of his words, but the emotionless tone in which he delivered them. He didn't appear insane or overtly violent. Instead, he was polite, intelligent, and disturbingly calm. It was as if he was recounting someone else's life story, not his own. When he stood in court, the world saw a man who looked like a typical middle-aged suburban father. Glasses, tie, neat posture. But his confession was unlike anything ever heard in a courtroom. For nearly 2 hours, he described his actions in chilling detail, speaking clearly, correcting himself when he misremembered a date or sequence. He seemed proud of his precision. During sentencing, the families of the victims faced him, expressing decades of grief and pain. Rader listened quietly, rarely showing emotion. When given the chance to speak, he offered a scripted apology, detached and almost mechanical. He said he was sorry, but made it sound more like a formality than genuine remorse. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, one for each known victim. Kansas had abolished the death penalty at the time of his crimes, meaning execution was not an option. The courtroom erupted in relief, though no sentence could truly heal the community. Once in custody, Rader underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Experts found traits consistent with narcissistic and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. He demonstrated an intense need for attention and control, coupled with a disturbing lack of empathy. He viewed his killings as projects, and himself as an operator, language that stripped humanity from his victims. Interestingly, he continued to communicate after his sentencing. Rader wrote letters to journalists, criminologists, and even students who studied his case. In these letters, he often spoke about Factor X, his term for the dark, internal force that pushed him to commit the murders. He believed it was part of his identity, something he could never escape. While awaiting transfer to state prison, Rader spent his first months in solitary confinement. Authorities feared that other inmates might attack him, given the notoriety of his crimes. The isolation also served another purpose. It kept him from using his manipulative charm to gain influence inside prison walls. Even in confinement, he tried to maintain control over his narrative. He corrected reporters, commented on documentaries, and occasionally requested books about criminal psychology. As if trying to study himself, his obsession with order extended to prison life. He meticulously organized his cell, kept detailed notes, and followed routines with near military precision. The question that haunted psychologists and journalists alike was simple. How could a man so ordinary commit acts so monstrous and keep them hidden for decades? Since his sentencing in 2005, Dennis Rader has been serving 10 consecutive life sentences at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. His days are strictly structured. He wakes early, eats alone, and spends most of his time in a small cell where every move is monitored. Prison officials keep him separated from the general population for his safety. His crimes made him a target among other inmates. Rader spends nearly all his time writing. He fills notebooks with reflections, sketches, and detailed timelines of his crimes and personal life. Some of his writings are introspective. Others show his continuing desire to control how people perceive him. He often tries to present himself as a misunderstood figure, someone who wanted recognition, not chaos. Despite being cut off from the outside world, he remains obsessed with his legacy. In prison, Rader has limited privileges. He receives occasional visits, including from his daughter Carrie, who struggled for years to reconcile her childhood memories with the truth about her father. She eventually wrote a book describing her emotional journey, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging both love and horror in her family's story. Their relationship remains complex, marked by forgiveness but not acceptance. Rader is allowed television, books, and mail, but every piece of communication is screened. He sometimes responds to letters from students and crime researchers, often discussing his case with chilling detachment. He refers to his alter ego BTK as a separate entity, describing it as a monster that lived inside him. This split identity continues to fascinate psychologists, who study him as an example of how narcissism, control, and fantasy can blend into real violence. Over the years, Rader's health has declined, and his public communication has slowed. Yet, his case still resonates in true crime documentaries, books, and university studies. For law enforcement, BTK's story remains a cautionary tale about the importance of forensic technology and the persistence of investigators. For society, it's a grim reminder that evil can exist behind ordinary faces. The Wichita community still carries the scars of fear and loss. Memorials for the victims remind residents of lives taken too soon and families forever changed. Each anniversary of Rader's arrest brings mixed emotions, relief that he is behind bars, and sorrow that such crimes ever occurred. Rader's name often appears in academic discussions about the psychology of control. He was not driven by money or revenge, but by the satisfaction of planning and executing what he called projects. He viewed his victims not as people but as components of his fantasy world, something experts define as a severe disconnection from empathy. Today, Rader is 70-plus years old and will never leave prison. His story continues to provoke both horror and fascination. Some criminologists call him one of the most ordinary serial offenders, a man who used routine and discipline to hide his darkness in plain sight. Others see him as a warning about how ego and pride can ultimately destroy even the most carefully hidden life. In his final years, Rader remains a study in contrasts, a man who seeks attention yet lives in silence, who once terrorized a city, yet now spends his days under constant watch. His capture ended one of the longest-running mysteries in American criminal history. But the psychological puzzle of Dennis Rader, the man behind BTK, will likely never be fully solved.